dialed in. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. First off, we'd like to start off with welcoming everyone. We'd like to thank our hosts, the PTAC at Schoolcraft College and Wayne State University, the Public Sector Construction Forum. We're actually here in Livonia and just finished up our meeting. The SAME Detroit Post and SAME National, NCMA Great Lakes, and Advanced Integrated Solutions are our hosts for today. Just like to let everyone know if they have any questions and answers can be typed on the side, and we have multiple sites and individuals calling in, so please keep those questions coming. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Ms. Vicki Machete is the Director of Defense and Industrial Base, DIB Cybersecurity Program Office under the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. She joined the Office of the Secretary of Defense in January 2011. Ms. Machete has experience working in industry, over 28 years of federal service, 22 years as a commissioned Air Force officer. Ms. Mary Thomas is our other presenter today, currently serves as a program analyst for the Director of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. In this position, Ms. Thomas is responsible for representing DPAP and the DoD contracting community in matters related to cybersecurity. Thank you both for presenting today, and I'm going to turn it over, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introductions. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicki Machete, and with me is Mary Thomas. Mary and I have done this briefing a number of times in different places, so we'll kind of go back and forth, so you'll get used to hearing from both of us. But today we're going to talk about cybersecurity challenges and how we're protecting DoD's unclassified information and the implementation of the DFARS Clause 252-204-7012, which we'll talk a lot about. Alex, could we go to slide number 2? So this is the outline. We'll talk a little bit in detail about the clause. We'll talk about adequate security, some of the requirements in the clause that include cyber incident reporting and damage assessments. We'll talk about compliance and what happens on December 31st of this calendar year. And then we have some resource information will be available to anyone who would like to access it. Just a note, given the presentation format, I think we'll go through the slides fairly quickly, and if you can send your questions in to Alex or however that process is working, we'll address those at the end of the presentation. So Alex, slide 3, please. All right, so a little bit about why we're here. A day doesn't go by that you don't hear about some cyber incident in the newspaper or on the TV or on the internet. And if you think back to 2017, we had WannaCry, we had several significant ransomware events, we had NotPetya, we had the Equifax breach, and if you go back even further in time, there was Opium, there was Sony, Anthem, RSA, Deloitte, JP Morgan, TJ Maxx, Target. The list goes on and on and on. And what we're seeing is that industry is being targeted by nation-state actors as well as people just trying to make some money. You can see 89% of the breaches had a financial or an espionage motive. It's relatively easy to download some malware, and if you can get someone to click on the link, you're in and you can take over that network. So it's pretty important that we have some basic network security out there for our industrial base. So if we go to the next slide, number 4, what DoD has been doing is a range of activities that include both regulatory and voluntary programs. So the first thing we are obviously going to look at is how are we securing our own DoD information systems and networks. But secondly, making sure that we have the right policies in place. As we depend on the defense industrial base to provide our warfighting capabilities. DoD doesn't build stuff themselves. We rely on ship makers and airplane builders and weapon systems developers to be able to have the capability to prosecute a war in the defense of our nation. So we are reliant upon the defense industrial base to get those capabilities put into place. So we want to make sure that our defense contractors are securing the DoD data or the information that's used to develop those capabilities whether it's through a contractual process or through voluntary processes. So we wrote a regulation. It's in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and that's what we're going to talk about today, that requires contractually certain safeguarding and other parts that we'll talk about. The DoD also has a Cybersecurity Information Sharing Program. That's the DIB Cybersecurity Voluntary Program. And that through this program, if you're in a defense, cleared defense contractor, you are eligible to apply to the program, and we share classified threat information as well as some unclassified actionable information. And finally, we are leveraging security standards that are appropriate for across the entire federal government, and NIST is the way we have approached it. We're going to leverage NIST Special Pub 800-171, which we'll also talk more about later in this presentation. Can we go to the next slide, please, Alex, number 5?
When we talk about protecting DoD's unclassified information, the manner in which we do that is going to depend on the type of information we want to protect and also on the type of information system that is being stored on. So while some version of our safeguarding clause has been in place since 2013, many people that are stakeholders in this environment are used to protecting DoD systems for a much longer time than they've had to deal with protecting a contractor's internal system. So this chart illustrates the differences between those things. In blue, you will see some of the things that are relevant for a DoD information system. In gray, we're focused mainly on a contractor's internal information system. So again, our DFARS rule that we talk about today, 252.204.70.12, is specifically designed to protect a contractor's internal information system. So it may be storing classified, controlled unclassified information, it may be storing covered defense information or federal contract information. For any of those types of information that require protection, you need to use those things that are specified in the DFARS clause when they're stored on a contractor's internal information system. So we have chart 6. So the way that the DFARS clause 252.204.70.12 protects our information is laid out in a summary view here. Basically, it requires contractors to do 5 things. First, they have to protect and provide adequate security to safeguard the covered defense information that is residing on their internal information system. When they are protecting that information system, they need to report any cyber incident that they discover either on that system or that affects the information that's being stored on it. In the event of a cyber incident, they would also need to submit any malicious software that they might discover in connection with that incident and submit it to the DoD Cybercrime Center. If the Department of Defense decided to do a damage assessment on that cyber incident, the contractor would support that damage assessment with any media or any other information the department might request to learn more about what information was actually compromised. And finally, when the contractor is going to flow down covered defense information or information that requires protection down through his supply chain, he must also flow down the DFARS clause. So only systems that are protected can house that information. So if you're giving that information to a supplier, you need to ensure first that they have the ability to protect it as well. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of these 5 requirements as we go through the brief. Chart 7. Let's first just briefly talk about what is covered defense information, and we'll also talk about what it is not. Covered defense information is not a new type of information that needs to be protected. It's just the way that we refer to information in this DFARS clause that has always required protection. What this DFARS clause is simply doing is telling you how to protect it. So if you look in the very first bullet of the covered defense information definition, it says information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to and consistent with law, regulation, and government-wide policies. So again, this is information that already has existing safeguarding and dissemination controls associated with it. We're not creating any new category of information in this clause. The second part of the definition is that when you receive this information from the government and it requires protection, it is the responsibility of the Department of Defense to indicate, either by marking that information or by otherwise identifying it in the contract, that it needs to be protected. So while this DFARS clause will be in the majority of contracts, the only exception being contracts for commercial off-the-shelf items, the clause does not always require the safeguarding of the internal information system. It only needs to be safeguarded when covered defense information exists and when that information is marked and you're notified that you're receiving it. The only other example of when you would need to ensure information is protected is when you're developing that information as part of the contract. So while the government may not have provided you covered defense information, if your effort requires that you develop it or receive it or store it, then that too needs to be protected when stored on your information system. Chart 8, please. So again, this just reiterates the fact that it is the responsibility of the government to identify the covered defense information that it provides to you as a part of the contract effort. And that marking, the way it's marked and the way it's identified, is going to be in accordance with existing DoD policy. So right now, that policy is DoD Manual 5200.01, Volume 4. While there is a new CUI rule that NARA put out and a new CUI registry that addresses things like marking, et cetera, for the Department of Defense, those things will eventually need to be implemented in DoD policy, but right now only existing DoD policy applies to our marking procedures. So what the contractor is responsible for is, once being notified that they have covered defense information, the contractor is now just responsible for following all of the terms of that contract, which means each of the requirements of the DFARS clause. Chart 9. Let's just talk a bit more about subcontractor flowdown. Again, we mentioned earlier that when you are required to provide covered defense information to a subcontractor or to someone in your supply chain, they also need to be made responsible for the protection of that information. As a prime contractor, you are responsible for the entire supply chain. So it's very important that you know what information is being flowed down into the supply chain and to know how it's being protected. If there were a case where you were not confident that a supplier was able to protect that information on their internal information system, then you either need to not flow it down, or you need to provide that supplier with access to that information in a way that does not require them to store it on their internal information system. That same principle holds true for the government. They need to ensure that they're only providing the information to a contractor that is absolutely required for them to perform the terms of that contract. So if someone, for example, in the supply chain is only building a bolt or some other small item, they do not need the whole tech data package in order to do that. And so those who are flowing down the information must be responsible for how that information flows down, and that only the information essential for the effort is being provided. Chart 10.
All right, so once you've determined that the clause is applicable and that you have covered defense information stored on the contractor's internal network, then it's the contractor's responsibility to provide at a minimum this following security protections, and that is the implementation of NIST 800-171, protecting CUI and non-federal information systems and organizations as soon as practical, but not later than December 31st of 2017. Now, these are minimum or security requirements. It does not mean that that's the only thing you should do, so that's why B3 is also included in the clause, that the contractor shall apply other information security measures that it's reasonably determined is necessary. So if you're already doing other things besides the requirements in 171, we don't want you to stop doing those good security measures and practices. Those should be continued. And as I said, this is really a minimum security requirement. If we go to slide 11, talk a little bit more about 171. Prior to NIST Special Pub 800-171, all we had available was NIST Special Pub 800-53, which is a very large catalog of security controls that were designed for implementation in federal government systems. There are many things in there that were really more about federal policies and how we would operate from a government perspective and not relevant to the industry. So NIST took the time to figure out what were the appropriate requirements that should be translated into a publication that would be focused on non-federal organizations. So the requirements that are in 800-171 today really fall into about 4 categories: policies and processes, IT configurations, and sometimes hardware or software requirements. There are, in revision 1 to NIST Special Pub 800-171, there are 110 security requirements. So as a company sits down to approach how am I going to comply with these requirements, we recommend that you first read through the publication. All the requirements are listed in Chapter 3. It's not a long read, but there are, some things that may be more complex than other parts of it. Then determine what you are actually doing already, because there's a very good chance that you have some IT security in place that will satisfy those requirements. What you aren't sure about, which requires additional research, or maybe you need to get a little bit of assistance to understand exactly what the controls or the requirements mean, and how you might want to satisfy those requirements. And finally, then, for those things that are not yet met, develop your plan of action and figure out how you're going to implement those requirements. Moving on to slide 12. Oh, 13, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is a chart that it's color-coded for those categories that I spoke of. The yellow is policies and processes, the blue is configuration, the orange color is the software solution, and the green is the hardware solution. So when you look at that, there's a lot of, you can see that not everything is green and orange. Many things don't require a material purchase or a monetary investment, but it comes down to policies and processes. So I could point out 3.1.1 is configuration because it's limiting access to the IT system by authorized users. So you can do that with configuration control. 3.2.3 is a yellow, it's policy and process. That one's for security awareness training. Many companies already do this. It's just a matter of making sure that you're addressing some of the basic security requirements associated with information systems. Moving on to 3.5.3, that's in about the center of the chart. That one is green because that is a requirement to have multi-factor authentication for users as they're logging into the system. So that is clearly a hardware requirement, and for some companies it's been more challenging, and some of them have found it easy to do. So there's a whole variety of potential solutions for multi-factor authentication, and NIST has a publication, I believe it's 800-63.3, that actually lists out all kinds of options. You don't have to have the most expensive option. There's a YubiKey is about $40 per person, and then if you want to go to the top end, you can get a category PIV-like card, which would cost a lot more money. And then if you jump over to 3.10.3, that's a policy because it requires you to escort visitors so that they don't access your network systems when you're not there. So there's a lot of different varieties of things here and a lot of ways to approach. And I want to call out one more. There was 3.5.11 is a configuration. This requirement, it says to obscure feedback of authentication information. So basically what this is if you're typing in a password and you get the little asterisk to cover up the word or the character as you enter it, that's what that's about. And that actually is a configuration that you can turn off, but what this requirement is to make sure that that configuration is in the on position. So next slide is number 14. So there are a lot of requirements in here. We recognize that a lot of companies will have solutions to those requirements, but it is possible that a requirement may not be applicable for some unique reason that has to do with your specific configuration in your IT system. So if you were to identify that, you would want to document that. Or if you had an alternative but equally effective security measure for a specific security requirement that's identified in 800-71. And the process for that is to submit a letter to your contracting officer explaining what your alternative is and how it would satisfy that requirement. The DoD CIO's office will adjudicate all of these requirements or all these alternatives, and we do that intentionally at the CIO level so that you get a common answer. If you have multiple contracts with multiple DoD components, we didn't want contractors to run into a problem where the Air Force said yes, the Army said no, and the Navy said do something else altogether. So we wanted to centralize the approval of those alternative solutions. Generally, under 800-171, you don't require alternatives. What we find is when a company has submitted a request for an alternative, it is either you're meeting the requirement or what you've suggested clearly will not ever meet the requirement. So there's usually nothing in between. The second part of this slide is about contracts awarded prior to October 1st. For all those contracts, the contractor is required to submit to CIO within 30 days of contract award a list of any security requirements not met at the time of contract award. The reason we did this is so that we could keep track of how well the industrial base was moving towards full compliance with all the 110 security requirements. So if you had a contract awarded after the 1st of October, that's no longer a requirement for you to fulfill.
So if we're in chart 15. If you think back to the first little circle chart, we talked about DoD systems, contractor internal systems, and Vicki just talked to you about how to provide adequate security to a contractor's internal system. The requirements of NIST Special Pub 800-171 apply. That chart also illustrated the existence of cloud environments. And so here we just summarize what kinds of protections apply to the cloud environment. And that too is going to depend on whether you're talking about a cloud environment that's part of the contractor's internal solution, his internal network, or if it's a cloud environment that's being operated on behalf of the Department of Defense. So at the top, we talk about a slightly different DFARS clause, 252.239.7010, which is called Cloud Computing Services. It was initially published along with our safeguarding clause. But this applies when the government is purchasing the ability to have cloud services on a DoD system. So these are, this is when a cloud service provider is operating on behalf of the DoD. In that case, something called the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, the SRG, applies. So in place of the NIST Special Pub 800-171 requirements, the contractor would be applying those requirements that they would find in the Security Requirements Guide, the SRG. Other than that, the reporting requirements, the requirement to support damage assessment, those are all very similar to what you find in the 7012 clause. So the same information that needs to be provided for us to understand how the government's information may be compromised, that all that is the same, it's just the protections that will vary. And then when we're talking about a cloud environment, that is really part of the contractor's internal system. So if the contractor develops his own cloud solution and is using that in his internal network, or if he's using something from a cloud service provider, but it's part of his internal solution. It's not specific to the government's effort. These are things that are covered by the DFARS 252-204-7012, but there's a variation in the requirements that apply. Again, it's not the NIST Special Pub 800-171, but in this case, they need to meet requirements equivalent to those established for the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. You probably referred to that as the FedRAMP program. And they need to be equivalent to the moderate baseline that you would find in FedRAMP. The reporting requirements, again, the requirement to facilitate damage assessment, those remain the same as in the remainder of the clause, but the requirements here would be equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. The reason why we say equivalent to, because it doesn't require a provider to have the certification that's required to have a government-approved FedRAMP program in place, but as long as they can meet requirements that are equivalent to that, that is enough to protect the contractor's internal cloud solution. It's up to the contractor to ensure that that offering is in fact equivalent to FedRAMP moderate, and he's the one that must attest to that fact. It is the contractor who's responsible for ensuring that those protections are in place. Chart 16.
So as Mary explained at the beginning of the presentation, there are certain requirements in the clause aside from the adequate security. One of those is cyber incident reporting. So when a cyber incident occurs on a covered contractor system, and it is a system where information, the covered defense information is stored or transmitting, then that cyber incident should be reported. And so a lot of people ask, what is a cyber incident? And that would be an action taken through the use of the computer network which results in a compromise, actual or potential adverse effect on the information or the information system. Whereas the compromise is a violation of the security policy of the system. So we see a lot of cyber incident reporting, that a spectrum of different types of reports. Sometimes we see reports of lost or stolen laptops that contain that covered defense information. We also see other situations where malware is executing on a network and an information system and there's beaconing or exfiltration of data. So you have a full spectrum of things. You would not necessarily need to report network pinging because that is not a case situation where the information has actually been compromised. So that's kind of the spectrum of reporting. We just note in the clause that just because you report a cyber incident, it should not be interpreted as evidence that there's anything wrong, that the contractor has failed to provide adequate security. We know that even if you've implemented every single requirement in this Special Pub 800-171, you may still have a cyber incident that needs to be reported. We can go to the next slide, number 17, I'm sorry. When you do report a cyber incident, it is reported via a web portal. And just a note that you need to have a DoD-approved medium assurance certificate to access that portal because we want to make sure we're setting up a secure connection for that information. If you are able to detect and isolate malicious software, then we ask you to submit that as well, and we have guidance for you on the portal itself. We will ask you to preserve media for 90 days so that if the contracting officer comes back and asks you to be able to have an image or a copy of that information that was compromised, we may want to do a deeper dive on that, which we'll talk about shortly. When you submit a cyber incident, the DoD Cybercrime Center is our central collection point for the department for all cyber incident reporting by defense contractors. So they're going to receive the report and they're going to provide a copy to the contracting officer identified on the form. So you don't necessarily have to go back and tell your contracting officer because we actually are going to do it for you. So although you may choose to do so, but it's not a requirement. The DC3 as a central collection point is able to analyze the different types of incidents that are occurring across the defense industrial base and identify, in some cases, new cyber threat vectors and trends from adversaries. This is important to us to help us understand the state of the cyber threats, and then we can get that information out and share that across the defense industrial base as well. DC3 may actually come back to the reporting company if there's information that's incomplete or we're unable to understand some of the information that was provided. So It's not a bad thing if they reach out and contact you, but they may in fact do so. We can move to slide 18. One of the reasons we want to understand when there has been a cyber incident is because the information that you're asked to protect is critical to the defense warfighting capabilities. So we have to understand what information may have been compromised, and so that we can make the proper adjustments in our own warfighting strategies. So that's when DoD decides to conduct a damage assessment. We do that to determine the impact of the compromised information on our U.S. military capability. We want to understand how that information could be used by adversaries to counter, defeat, or reverse engineer our capabilities. When I began this conversation, we talked a little bit about 89% of the breaches had a financial or an espionage motive. Understand that the adversaries that are coming after us from an espionage perspective are looking to kill, counter, or clone our capabilities. So stealing the data makes it easy for them to do so. So we really want to focus on what information was impacted so that the department can then make decisions about how to either protect that capability for future acquisitions or how to protect our warfighters that are employing that capability in a warfighting situation. So we can come up with other ways in a concept of operations or other mitigations and strategies to protect the warfighter, and that's why we do the damage assessment. We can move on to the next slide, number 19. We're going to talk about compliance.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to comply with the DFARS Clause and what it means to implement the NIST 800-171. So first, let's talk about complying with the clause itself. Like any other term of the contract and any other clause that you would find in your contract, when you sign the contract, you are, by virtue of signing it, attesting to the fact that you meet the terms of that contract. So when you sign a contract with DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012 in it, you're now stating that you will safeguard your system, you will report any cyber incident, you will slow down the clause when the information is flown down, etc. So in that regard, it's really the contractor's responsibility, upon signing that contract to ensure that they are in fact complying with all the terms of that contract, to include complying with the NIST 800-171. The government is not going to have any unique or different certification process to come in and ensure that the contractor is implementing NIST 800-171, just as it would not do that for any other term in the contract. The government also doesn't require the contractor to have some third party come and assess or certify their system. The government will take the contractor's word when they state that they are in compliance with the contract and implementing the 171. That is what the government requires. Now, you can imagine there are some programs where it may be more important for the information, for the requiring activity to have assurance that their information is being protected. And some organizations may be willing to invest the resources required to have additional oversight over that process. So when those cases occur, the government would need to write any added requirements into the terms of the contract, because the scope of the DFARS Clause itself does not cover that. So if an organization does want to understand more about the scope and the status of your information system, they want to be able to ensure that you are in fact implementing all those requirements and how you're implementing those requirements. They would write that into the terms of the contract, and that would be part of that bilateral agreement. When you sign the contract, that would be known up front that those added requirements would apply. Chart 20. Now, let's talk about what does it mean to actually implement NIST 800-171. So the publication was revised last December in 2016, and under that revision, there was a new requirement. The 110th requirement was added, and that was requirement 3.12.4 for a system security plan. Now, a system security plan was referenced in the initial publication, but it wasn't documented as a specific requirement. So this revision adds it as a specific requirement. And the system security plan is just a place where the contractor will document the status of his information system. He'll describe system boundaries, different environments of operation, and he will describe how they are implementing the security requirements on their network. Along with that system security plan, there was already an existing security requirement to have plans of action in place, requirement 3.12.2. And these plans of action is where the contractor will document how they're going to correct deficiencies in their system, how they would reduce or eliminate any vulnerabilities that might exist. And it's also where they would document how and when they're going to implement any unimplemented requirements out of the 110 requirements that they are required to implement. Chart 21. So let's talk about what does that mean when looking at this deadline that is in the DFARS clause to implement NIST 800-171 by December 31st. What this essentially means is that if you have a system security plan in place that documents the status of your information system and how you're implementing the requirements, and if you also have plans of action in place to document how and when you will implement any unimplemented requirements, you are now documenting your implementation of 171, and this demonstrates compliance with that requirement of the DFARS clause. There's no requirement for you to submit your system security plan to the department, but the department may request it in the solicitation or in some other manner during the procurement process. So they can also choose to consider the state of your system in the procurement process, but again, that would have to be written into the solicitation and into the terms of the contract. It is really to your benefit as the contractor and to the government's benefit as well that a system security plan and any plans of action would be incorporated into the contract, even if just by reference, so that there is now a record of the status of the system at contract award. So if there is agreement between the contractor and the government that a particular set of requirements are not going to be implemented until a date after 2017, you want that documented in your contract for some later date. Let's go to chart 22. This chart really talks about how the system security plan may now also be used as part of the source selection process. So again, the DFARS clause requires a minimum level of protections in implementing the security requirements in NIST 800-171. It allows you to have a system security plan in place and plans of action that state when and how you're going to implement those requirements. But for organizations that care a lot more about the state of your system, they can make that a part of the selection process. This is some examples of how they can do that, but however that's going to happen would need to be written, again, into the solicitation and into the terms of the contract. But this is when it becomes important to have not only the status of your system documented, but to ensure that whatever you document, that you in fact do what you're going to say in those plans. Chart 23. So we've been out speaking to a lot of folks, as Vicki mentioned earlier, and as a result of that, we've been able to put together a lot of resources and point to a lot of places that can assist you in this process. So one source of information is NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnership. They, like the PTACs, are located throughout the country, and they actually published very recently a workbook. The chart says draft, but my understanding is that it now has been published in final. So you can find this self-assessment workbook online just by Googling the name, if that's the only way you can find it. And it is a good way to step through how to implement these security requirements. It's directed at the manufacturing sector, but we have heard from many small businesses that this was a great way for them to get a better understanding of what some of these security requirements mean. Again, we know that we have some PTACs participating today, and we've been trying to reach out to the PTAC program at DLA and their centers to get information that's going to be helpful to them in their hands. I'm going to let Vicki talk a little bit about the CSET tool that DHS has put together.
The cybersecurity evaluation tool is basically an online program, or it's a application, if you will, developed by DHS for the Industrial Control System Cyber Emergency Response Team. It gives you a step-by-step process. You go in and answer a bunch of questions, and it'll help you develop basically your system security plan. It'll ask you for boundaries, and you put that information in and your output in the end and how you're implementing the requirements. So it's a nice tool. It's downloadable from a DHS site. If we could go to slide number 20. I'll give you a link later on. Sorry about that. But you can download it from DHS, or you can request that it be sent to you. I think it's a really useful tool if you have a pretty good understanding of the requirements, and you can just go in and answer the question. If we could go to, we want to add that there is also an assessment guide now that NIST has published. It's NIST Special Pub 800-171 Alpha. And that is out for comment right now, for public comment. There's extended that period until sometime in January. So if you want to take a look at that and have comments, you can do that and provide them back to NIST.
It also is a very helpful way to get a good step-by-step approach to what it means to implement some of these requirements.
If we can move to slide number 24, and we're almost done, and we'll wrap it up and take some questions. Slide 24, it talks a little bit about the DIB cybersecurity program. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a voluntary partnership for, it does require you to be a cleared company because we do share classified information. But the program itself does help participating companies better understand the cyber threats and then how they might want to mitigate those threats. We move to slide 25. This is a picture of what the web portal currently looks like. If you notice, if you need to report a cyber incident, there's a big, huge block that says report a cyber incident. That is what you require a medium assurance certificate for that. If you're interested in the DIB cybersecurity program, you can apply to the program, and then the final space is logging into the portal. Please note that you do not have to apply to the program to report a cyber incident. Anyone can provide a cyber incident or report a cyber incident. We move on to slide number 26. These are the resources we mentioned. DPAP has done a great job with the DoD procurement toolbox.com. It has absolutely everything associated with this clause, from frequently asked questions, and it's on the cyber page on the end at that site. It has the policies themselves. It has webinars and a whole bunch of other resources there. So I encourage you to look at that. That's kind of great one-stop shopping. There's also information posted on the DPAP website provided, and there's the cybersecurity evaluation tool we mentioned, and that's where you would go to download or request a copy. We provide also references to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and the PTAP program. And finally, for questions, if you have things that are not answered today or come up later, please go ahead and submit via email to the address of there listed, osb.dibcsia@mel.mil. We are happy to answer any questions that come up. And so with that, I think the last thing we have, the last slide, is just a question slide. I understand there have been some questions. The first question was, what recommendations do you have for new federal contractors interested in pursuing defense work that may or may not have covered defense information? So what I would suggest is that if you're going to sign a contract with a department and you have the covered defense information, or you will have covered defense information, you need to have looked in advance at NIST Special Pub 800-171. So my recommendation would be is if you're thinking about doing business with the Department of Defense, that you sit down and read through the publication, see where you're at, evaluate what you need to do to become compliant, because you're going to need to have that available at the time of the solicitation. So that's where I would start. And the other thing I would say is make sure you understand your system boundaries, what you're actually doing within your network, and where you're saving, where you're keeping the sensitive information. Maybe your own proprietary information that hasn't become a DoD program. So I would say make sure you understand your system, where you're storing your information that's sensitive, and then looking at the implementation of the security requirements. I would add that there is a federal acquisition regulation case open right now to implement the controlled and classified, the CUI program. This FAR case is going to, at some point, apply the security requirements for NIST 800-171 to all federal contracts that have controlled and classified information. So it's something that if you're continuing to do business with the government that you might want to address.
And I would just add that as you go through the 171, and again, if you're brand new to this, something like that, the manufacturing and extension partnership tool might be extremely helpful to help you understand that process as you walk through it. And even if you don't have contracts in place now, if you, as you go through that, document the state of your system in a system security plan, that then allows you to at least be under contract with the government, because again, you need to have that system security plan in place. It's going to be up to the requiring activity as to whether or not the status of your system is going to be adequate for their information, but for many of these contracts, you know, it might be enough for them to understand that you have a handle on where your system is and you're working towards getting these things in place. So I think it's good to have that system security plan documented at a minimum as you move forward, even while you're just working on implementation.
So another question came in, what types of CUI information may be shared with architecture, engineering, construction, and environmental firms? So I would refer you back to the CUI definition that says it's information that requires protections under law, regulations, or government-wide policy. So CUI is not new information that requires protection, but it's information, what we're doing in this rule is telling you how to protect that information. We're not telling you necessarily what exactly that is. Now, if you looked at the CUI registry, you could go through and see the different categories of information. I mean, the best examples are PII, personally identifiable information, HIPAA information, export controlled information, things like that that have and technical information like drawings and diagrams and things like that. All of those are required to be protected under some law, regulation, or government-wide policy. So in terms of the architecture, engineering, construction, and environmental firms, you could, in theory, get any type of information that requires protection. But remember that it has to be identified in the contract that you're required to protect that information. Mary, do you have anything to add?
And if there were, it was not clear to you upon reading the solicitation whether or not information, covered defense information would be involved, that is a conversation that you would definitely want to have with the requiring activity via the contracting officer to make sure that there's a good understanding of what that information is. I think we mentioned earlier that there may be cases where you might be able to get access to the information that's needed in a manner that won't require you to store it on your network. So we have found some cases where the use of the information requiring protection is limited in a manner that makes that perhaps a reasonable approach. In other cases, that might not work. But it's good to have a really good understanding with the required activity of exactly what is required to be protected. I will note that we've had conversations with many groups after being notified via the email address Vicki provided earlier, and have helped people step through that process of whether what they're dealing with is or is not covered defense information. And so we bring the folks in that have a better understanding of that depending on what category of information you're dealing with, and they can walk you through it a little bit better.
So here's another question for you, Mary. How does a prime contractor ensure that a subcontractors following the requirements and guidelines? Does the prime assume all the risk?
So the prime is responsible for the entire supply chain because the government has a contract with the prime, and the prime is now responsible for the rest. But the tools that the prime can use it's the same approach that the government can use. So just as the government can know that we would place on you the requirement to implement 171. You have to document that in your system security plan. The government may or may not ask for that system security plan. So if it's just a normal procurement that the information is not critical enough for there to be a great need to understand exactly how you're applying those protections, the government may not ask for the system security plan. However, if there's a great concern about the state of your system, the government will ask for your system security plan, and they'll want to understand what you're doing. If they ask you and want to understand what you're doing, that's a good sign that you probably need to ask and understand what your suppliers are doing as well, or at least understand when you're giving them information that requires protection. Some of your suppliers may not get that information, but those who do, if they store it on their system, it needs to be protected. So you may want to ask them for their system security plan. You may want to ask them for their plans of action and what they're doing to get those protections in place. And if you're not confident that the information is being protected, you would want to provide other means for them to get that information.
So we have another question here. Should we employ these controls, systems, processes, procedures for all information related to defense work just to learn best practices, create lessons learned, and increase efficiencies with our processes? Or does that make it more difficult down the road to separate CUI from non-CUI? So let me take that second half of the question first. There's no requirement to separate CUI from non-CUI. That's just not a requirement, right? When it's being stored on the information system. So from your perspective, if you do not have the covered defense information, then you don't necessarily have to implement, the requirement. But if you are implementing the security requirements because you have covered defense information on your information system, I would, in my opinion, it makes sense to me to make sure that you're safe. You don't want to, you could isolate just the DoD work away from the rest of your information system, which might be more costly, but it's something that you could do. That is one approach. Not everyone will take that approach because you would have to know what CUI you have and where you have it and make sure that it stays only on that isolated network. But I think that over time, you have other sensitive information that you might want to be protecting. So establishing the minimum security requirements in 800-171 is not a bad thing for your enterprise system.
And just looking at it from a little bit different approach, yes, these requirements are to protect the information system. It's not specific to any information. So once you have your information system protected, yes, some may say, okay, so now it doesn't matter. If we just store everything on that information system that's protected, we know the information will be protected. And yes, that's very true. The problem, though, lies when you now have to provide that information to a supplier, and a supplier may or may not have the ability to protect the information on his system. So if you merge all your information together and don't distinguish between what requires protection and what doesn't, it may cause a problem later on for you as you flow that information down to your suppliers, if you're not able to distinguish what actually requires protection.
So I think those are all the questions. We appreciate.
Real quickly, Vicki and Mary.
Sure.
We have a couple questions coming in from the Schoolcraft PTAC office here, and so I just ask that they unmute their line momentarily and go ahead with a few of their inquiries if your schedule permits. I know we're right up at that 10 o'clock time frame right now.
We've got a couple minutes, so go ahead.
Yep. So Jim from RBV Contracting had a question.
Yeah, just like a clarification on any contracts executed prior to October of 2017, what our responsibility is there with this?
So with regard to reporting what you are not yet implementing, is that what you're referring to? There is a requirement in the clause for contracts that are awarded prior to October 2017 that within 30 days of award, you would report to the CIO what requirements you're not yet implementing. So again, that was put in place so we could have a big picture view of how the Defense Industrial Base was doing in terms of progressing to implementation of the NIST 800-171 requirements. After October 2017, we realized that the system security plan now becomes the way that we would have an understanding of the state of the systems. But if you in fact were awarded a contract prior to October 2017, you do have a requirement to report to CIO any of the requirements that were not being implemented at the time of award. So to ensure that you're in compliance with that contract, you should report to the CIO on those requirements. It only needs to be the number of the requirement. It doesn't need to be any details. It just needs to state, you know, our contract so-and-so, whatever the contract number, and then what requirements are not yet being implemented. You don't need to provide a plan or anything else in that report.
But please know that if you have this clause in your contract prior to the 1st of October, all the other things are immediately effective. So the requirement to report a cyber incident, to participate in damage assessment, to submit malware, and to flow down the clause. So the only thing that was there was some time allotted for was the implementation of the security requirements in 171.
Did that address your question?
Jim, does that answer your question?
No, but I think Bree understands it.
Okay. All right.
I guess and I must be missing something. I mean, if that's a new clause, how could it be in the contract October 1st?
You got to look in the contract. It should be, there's a DFARs clause in there.
Okay.
If you signed it, then it means it applies.
So do we have any of them in those contracts?
Got to look at them.
Yeah. So it's a good idea then
to the clause is actually not new, so you know, but you do want to make sure that some version of the clause is probably in there.
That answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If no one else has any questions, that concludes our session. I'd really like to thank Vicki and Mary. Excellent information. I'm not sure if the slides are available to be provided. If someone requests it, maybe Alex can get with you folks after.
We did record today's session, so that will be made available. And for those that dialed in, I believe if you just reach out to the PTAC office here at the ptac@schoolcraft.edu, that recording can be made available to you via email there.
And we would just reiterate also that at DoDProcurementToolbox.com, briefings very similar to this, some more extensive, some shorter are available there as well. And a lot of other documentation, too, that you probably will find helpful.
All right, beautiful. Well, thank you, everyone. If no one else has anything, we will be signing off.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.